Today, we become legends.
Hey, my name's Inta and welcome back to the channel. So with Smite 2 releasing, there have been a lot of plus ones, a lot of changes made to the gods as they come over to Smite 2. But at least from what we've heard on the Titan talks and stuff, it seems like they're very hesitant to do full-on kit reworks like they've done in Smite 1's past. They've basically said that a lot of the reworks that they've done, the community generally hasn't been happy with, which I think is somewhat true, especially with their more modern reworks. And so I thought, you know what, Smite 1, it's over and done with now. We're probably not getting any more reworks in Smite 1. They're only going to be in Smite 2, if anything, as some of these gods transition over. I think it's about time to do a full definitive S2F tier list for all of these gods that have been reworked in Smite's past. And as you can see from a couple of them down here, most notably Basset and Freya, they've actually had more than one rework, so we're going to rank those individually. And basically what I class as a rework is like there's been significant changes made to the god. Ultimately, it's at my own discretion, but like, for example, I don't class those changes that he got a few years ago as like a full-on rework in my opinion. Like, they just made his 3 ever so slightly different and added an effect to his ultimate. That's much more like a sort of +1 change that they would do coming into Smite 2. It's not a full-on rework in my opinion. And also class changes don't count for me either. So like when Hades went from Guardian to Mage, I don't class that as a rework. He still plays the same. He still has the same kit. And finally, I don't really classify god changes as reworks either. So for example, when Hunbats became Hunbats instead of Sun Wukong and Sun Wukong got a new kit, that's not a rework in my opinion. That's a completely new god. And the same thing for when that happened with Ao Kuang. So I'm not going to be ranking those either because they're not really reworks in my opinion. But with all that preamble out of the way, let's jump right in with our first rework, and that is going to be Arachne's rework, which happened a long time ago. And basically, I'll say this now, what my criteria is for a successful rework is, does it fix the problems that were inherent with the previous design? So whether that problem is that the god is not fun, you know, did they make the god more fun, or whether that problem is that they were toxic to play against, are they less toxic to play against in their new design while retaining a lot of the fun that the actual players have with it. And some of these cases are different, you know, some just weren't fun, some were ridiculously unbalanced, some were really frustrating to play against, and basically, did the rework fix those problems is what I'm looking at here. And so first up is Arachne's rework, which I think I'm going to throw to C or B tier. I think to be generous, because probably a lot of the reworks on this list will be going in the lower tiers, I'll throw Arachne's rework to B tier. Arachne's old design, I've got some notes on the side here. So basically, Arachne's old design was her 1, you placed down some egg pods and anyone that came near them activated them. Her 2, you would jump on someone's head and suck the life out of them. You would basically steal health from them. Her 3 literally just shot a web that created a slow area, didn't do any damage, did nothing else. And then her ultimate just pulled people in with a cocoon. So it was basically Sylvanas pull, but it stunned them at the end of it as well. And while Arachne's old design was interesting, there's definitely a couple of elements there that you can maybe pull from. You could do like early Gold Fury solos by setting up 6 egg pods throughout the match and then pulling it at 5 minutes. There was some fun stuff there, but ultimately Arachne's old design wasn't very good either. But also that leads me into my second point about why this rework wasn't too good. Arachne's new design is also pretty toxic and annoying to play against. A lot of people do find her fun, and I doubt they're going to significantly rework her in Smite 2 for that reason, but her new design isn't good. Her old design wasn't good either. So ultimately this rework didn't do much in either direction, which is why I think it deserves a B tier. Next up, we have Erlang Shen, which is one of the more modern reworks that Smite has done, so probably a lot of you remember this one. And I think I'll throw Erlang to C tier. So Erlang, prior to this change, did have his problems, but removing the knockup was just, it kind of killed his entire playstyle, really. Like, the whole way you played Erlang completely changed in this rework for the worse, in my opinion. Yeah, they added some kind of cool stuff, like lifesteal and damage reduction on his 1 and stuff like that. A big fat shield on the turtle form of his 3 that scaled off of your prots, I think it scales off of. But yeah, ultimately, this rework just made him feel worse to play and didn't really take away, honestly, all that much of the frustration factor of playing against him. And obviously, since then, they brought the knockup back to Erlang Shen, and he feels a lot better for it. But the only reason this one isn't in the F tier is because it didn't completely destroy the god. You know, Erlang was still Erlang. He was just Erlang, but lesser without his knockup. So I don't think it deserves an F tier. It didn't completely kill the fun of the god or anything, but it did make him significantly less fun and didn't really solve any of the frustration problems anyway. Next up is Cupid, which you might be surprised to see on this list, and arguably I shouldn't have included him, but basically Cupid at one point was essentially reworked into a mage. They gave him more ability damage and made him scale with magical power instead. This was back in the days where all auto attacks were physical and scaled with physical power, so it was kind of an interesting way to look at Cupid, and it got reverted after a patch basically. So I think I'll just throw this one to C tier. It didn't really do too much, honestly, but the fact that it got reverted almost instantly makes me think it probably wasn't a good idea. even though I wasn't playing at the time this happened in 2013. Next up, we have Guan Yu, the most infamous OP god release in Smite history. I think I'll throw Guan Yu's rework to A tier. I think this one overall was really good. There were a lot of problems with the original release Guan, mainly balance problems. I think they probably could have fixed him and kept him as a magical guardian and it wouldn't have been a problem. Which is why this rework doesn't go to S tier, because I don't even think it was fully necessary. I think they could have kept him as a guardian and balanced his numbers, but ultimately, release Guan Yu completely broke the game and was ridiculously unfun to play against. I've got many videos on it on why it was so unbalanced. If you're interested in the specifics, you can check out my channel for those. But yeah, I think overall this rework was good, and Guan Yu's current design is absolutely fine. All that really happened in this rework was changing him from magical to physical and changing his ultimate from what was essentially Amaterasu's original ultimate. It was repurposed from Guan Yu and given to Amaterasu, and they changed it into his current ultimate, basically. They also changed his passive. I think his old passive was like extra protections when near any kind of structure or something like that, which was a little bit boring. And his passive now has more synergy with his kit, and obviously his numbers are a lot more balanceable as a physical. So overall, I think it was a good rework. Next up, we have Hell, which I believe was probably the first rework that ever happened in Smite. Hell got a rework very early in like the alpha phases of the game. A lot of people probably don't know about the original Hell design. I didn't before doing research for videos in the past. And basically the main differences between Hell now and Alpha Hell, I've got some notes here, where her one was like a toggle ability that turned your auto attacks into either a single target homing damage or a single target homing heal, based on your stance, obviously. In Dark Stance, it would essentially lock onto an enemy. You would hold down your auto attack and it would just slowly sap life from them over time. And with the Light Stance version, it would lock onto an ally and slowly heal them over time. And I think it's an interesting way to do an ability, but likely, I didn't play back then, so I don't know if this is the case, but it was likely pretty unbalanced. A lot of people do talk about Alpha Hell being arguably the best a god has ever been, even comparing it to release Guan Yu. And this was probably the reason why, because it literally locked onto people. It was unmissable and it just slowly like sapped your life force in Dark Stance or just slowly healed allies in Light Stance. I think for the heal, it probably wouldn't be quite as bad because it is quite annoying with Hell's current one in Light Stance where you end up missing your ally and stuff. I think a lock on for a heal, you know, I mean, Aphrodite's case kind of locks onto allies and stuff like that. I think that would be fine, but a lock on damage where it's completely unmissable and you just slowly sap your target's life force was probably pretty frustrating to play against. Her 2 was a little different as well. So in Dark Stance, it summons 3 souls that go towards her enemies. Once they hit a target, they will slowly just do tick damage over 3 seconds and then seek out another nearby target and do the same thing. And her 2 in Light Stance was a spell shield that lasted 6 seconds and absorbed 1 enemy ability a hit. So straight up, any ability that hits you when you've got this on you in the next 7 seconds, completely negated. And so that's a pretty interesting design space, but I imagine the reason they haven't made it into a thing in any future designs is that it was probably very hard to balance, much like a lot of this stuff with Alpha Hell. And the only other major change really with Alpha Hell was that Repulse did an insane amount of damage and also slowed during the alpha design as well. And so ultimately, I think I'm going to throw this one to the B tier because I think there were some interesting things in Alpha Hell's design that maybe could be looked at, but also like her current kit has a few problems as well. It's not like it completely fixed all of Hell's problems. She can still cause pretty cancerous healing metas. She does still do a lot of damage considering how much healing and utility she has. And ultimately, I think this is kind of a wash. I think it fixed some problems with Alpha Hell that were really going to be hard to balance, like the spell shield and the lock-on damage, but also took away some elements that I think were quite cool, like the lock-on heal. So yeah, ultimately, I would say this rework is a bit of a wash, similar to Arachne. The old design had problems, the new design has problems. They were good and bad elements of both designs, in my opinion. Next up, we have Kali, who I think I will throw to the C tier. So this was also a very early in Smite's lifecycle rework. And basically, original Kali was an ability-based assassin. So her passive just gave her lifesteal and more lifesteal when she was low health. Her 1 gave her a physical power and movement speed buff and made all of her abilities and auto attacks apply a short bleed. Her 2 was just a cone damage effect. It was basically for Mana's 2. There wasn't really much difference there. Her 3 was sort of like a Camazot's 3, but around her. So she just damaged around her and healed for all the targets hit. And then her ultimate was similar to her current ultimate, except there was no can't die mechanic because she didn't have the same passive that she has now. So there was no need for that. And it did way more damage and was a larger AoE around her and ticked faster. So basically she just spun around, did tick damage all around her, pretty much unavoidable. She could very easily catch up to you with the movement speed buff from her 1. And this would apply the bleed ticks from her 1 repeatedly, which was really powerful. She did seem a little bit overpowered in her original design, but I think it was definitely balanceable. And I've never really heard anything on why she was reworked, to be honest, because I did kind of like this design. I didn't play with it, actually. I should say that. I didn't play with it, but I've watched gameplay of it, and I've seen the abilities, descriptions and stuff. It seems like quite a cool design. And I think there's a lot of interesting stuff in there. I think it would have played quite cool. But new Kali is a big problem in the game. She always has been. Not being able to die, being able to heal like 80% of her health bar. That's been nerfed a lot over the years to like way less than 80%, but it was originally 80 or 90% of her health bar. And she's really just one of those W key. As soon as I get to late game, I'm just going to left click W your whole team down, and there's not really a whole lot you can do about it. She farms uncoordinated lobbies. She's very frustrating to play against. And I do think the original design, if they could have balanced it properly, would have been more healthy for the game, which is why it's reworked in C tier. But ultimately, I can see some problems with the original design as well, which is why it's not quite an F tier. tier rework in my opinion. Next up, we have the Loki rework, which goes straight to S tier. It might be one of the few reworks that do go to the S tier in my opinion. On the Titan Talks, I said at the beginning of this video, like on the Titan Talks, they said they don't want to do reworks because most the community views as unsuccessful. Loki was the one they specifically said, yeah, this was one of the few reworks that everyone basically loved. I'm sure there's a few diehard Loki mains out there that really loved his old design. Personally, I do think his old design was more fun to play as, but I am absolutely willing to sacrifice a little bit of fun playing as Loki to have a lot more fun playing against Loki, because original Loki's design was super toxic. Everyone knows this. He was basically the most hated god in the game for the longest time. Arguably, you could say he still is, but for me personally, he's not anymore. I think new Loki's design is a lot more tolerable, and there are some other gods I hate more, like Nox and Aphrodite and Freya. But yeah, I do think the Loki rework, it preserved his general playstyle, and it made him a lot more fun to play against. So I think this was ultimately one of the most successful reworks Smite ever did. Definitely S tier. Moving on though, we have Nox, which I think I will throw to the... Oh, does it go to the F tier or to the C tier is the question. I think it probably does go to F. Ultimately, I kind of want to put it in C because original Nox did have some problems within her kit. And that was namely that she was actually super weak with this design. When she originally released, she was probably one of the most underpowered releases we've ever had. And she had two different passives throughout this original design. They were still based around the candles that she has now. But once all forward lit, her next ability cost no mana was the original design. And then they reworked that at some point into for every candle lit, she has 4% damage mitigation. And obviously, whenever she takes damage, she loses a candle as well. Her one was a 80%, I believe it was 90 at release, damage mitigation shield that lasted only 1 second. They did change it to 2 seconds later on and nerf the damage mitigation down a little bit. But on the original design, it was a 90% damage mitigation for 1 second. So basically, if you time this correctly, you can nullify almost everything. It was basically like an Aegis, but for less time. And I think this was really cool. I think it was a cool ability. You know, it's very skillful. You've got 1 second of activation. It was a little bit reminiscent of original Nemesis shield. Nemesis shield was also 1 second and reflected and healed for infinite damage. And that was also changed with Nemesis, so maybe they don't like this kind of design where gods can have this like almost near immunity to everything as long as you're skillful enough and time it right. But I think it was a pretty cool ability. Her second ability in original form was basically her silence. So she would just launch a Raven forward, deals damage, silences for 2 seconds, and this was basically combined with her old 3, which was similar to her new 2. It didn't have the silence effect and it activated a lot quicker, but it was just a circular AoE damage on a very low cooldown. This was a 4-second cooldown. It might have even been a 3-second cooldown on launch. And this also had a mechanic where it did 50% bonus damage to anyone hit by Shroud of Darkness, which was her 2. So basically her general combo back then was hit them with your 2, they're silenced, they can't get away, hit them with your 3 because it was a much faster activation time back then, so you could very easily do that and you get the 50% bonus damage. But her ultimate in her original design was what I think was probably the most interesting, maybe tied with her 90% damage mitigation shield. So her original ultimate would essentially link her to up to 3 nearby enemy gods, and whenever they cast an ability, they took the damage of the ultimate. The damage of the ultimate was relatively low. It was 190 plus 75% scaling, so mainly you're getting a lot of that value from the scaling, but it does damage initially, and then anytime an enemy god casts an ability while linked to you, I think you had to go pretty far away to break the link, you would take the ultimate's damage again. So it was sort of like an anti-mage ability. You know, you would activate this on the whole backline, and then pretty much they can't really retaliate without taking a lot of damage. And they did make a change at some point during her design to make it so that at the end of the effect, they took damage and were stunned. Originally, that wasn't the case. It was purely just they had to cast abilities to take damage after the initial hit. And so they tried to add that on the end where like you at least get some value because they take initial hit damage and then final hit damage and that's done. But obviously it take a lot more if they're casting abilities during the channel. And I think this was a really interesting design, which is why Nox is in F tier. I don't think it would have worked if it was completely left unchanged. But I think with some tweaks to this design, or at least, you know, taking some of these aspects into the new design would have been cool. And of course, the main reason Nox is in F tier though is because her current design is absolute trash in my opinion, and deserves another rework. Is that going to happen? I doubt it, but current Nox is just insanely frustrating to play against, and that's the main reason this is in F tier. If Nox's current kit was more fair and fun, she might be in C or B tier because her old design did have problems. But ultimately, I would rather have a fun design that's interesting than just I'm going to press 2 and 1 on cooldown and be even more frustrating than her old design. So yeah, that's why it's in F tier. Next up, we have Newa, which unfortunately is another F tier in my opinion. I played the shit out of Old Wa. I think she was a lot more fun than Newa. But at least in Smite 2, with the +1s that they've given her, they've kind of carried over a little bit of what made Old Wa so special with the crystal mechanics. So yeah, similar to Smite 2, Newa's original design, basically every single ability activated a different crystal. Her one was very much similar to her current one. Summons fogs, you get increased movement speed in the fog, but the fog would follow you in her original design, so it would be a little bit easier to kind of stay within the fog. It would follow you, I believe, 95% of your original movement speed. Her clay soldiers were very similar, except you spawned had less of them at rank 1, but more of them at rank 5. So you summoned up to 5 rank 5 of the ability, and obviously there was no exploding them with her 3 like there is in her current design. Her 3 was a very small circular AoE damage ability that would stun enemies on hit and then ignite them for burn damage, and this would activate the fire crystal, basically very similar to her new crystal that she's got in Smite 2. It would give her AoE basic attacks for a limited duration after you use her old 3. And interestingly, her old 3 could hit towers, so that's a pretty cool aspect of it. And then her old ultimate was basically Ganesha's ultimate. You would take damage whenever you move through the fields and you would be slowed massively. It was basically all Ganesha ultimate, and that would activate the metal crystal, which granted you double basic attack damage for the duration. So as you can see, they are bringing a little bit of this back in Smite 2, which I think is really cool. Basically, she would like ascend to her full snake form when she had all crystals active, and then you would have like double auto attack damage. You would have AoE auto attack. She could kind of shred people down pretty effectively. And ultimately, I think Olbar was a really fun design. I genuinely enjoyed her a lot. You know, compared to Nox's old design, I think it was a lot of fun, but it did have problems. Personally, I don't think Newa's old design had that many problems. I think with some modern updates, if they'd have kept with it, it could be a really fun kit design. And of course, Newa is just incredibly frustrating to play against. The main issue is her ultimate, obviously. I think her base kit is like kind of fine. It's a little bit boring, but I don't really have a major problem with it. But it is just her new ultimate is so incredibly boring, uninteractive, unfun, frustrating to play against. Just completely free damage and vision and safety and stuff. It's just really annoying to play into. So yeah, Newa's design, mainly her ultimate, not a big fan of. And then I was a big fan of her old design, which is why I think this rework is F tier. Next up though is Odin, which I think I'm going to throw to the A tier. So Odin has had a few changes over the years that I would classify as a significant rework. So in Odin's original design, his 2, you didn't get the Raven Shout shield. You did an AoE attack speed buff to all of your allies. That was pretty much all it did, so it was a little bit boring. And his original 3 was, you may have played during this time if you've been playing Smite for a while. He just spun around, did 2 hits of damage and slowed people. It was a little bit boring as well. And so they replaced the 2 with the Raven Shout shield that allows him to do the bird bomb, and then they replaced the 3 with his current 3 where it does a pulsing tick damage, and then you throw the spear for either a stun or an attack speed buff on allies, sort of taking inspiration from his old 2. And ultimately, I think these changes were really positive for him. Bird bomb is a lot of fun to use. It's pretty hilarious with how much damage it does. His 3 is a lot more interesting now compared to his old 3. There are some kind of minor problems with Odin's design at the moment, especially with how low his cooldowns can be and how he can just like jump and shield and stun you and then jump again and shield and stun you again. Like, you can just keep rotating through his cooldowns, so he's very hard to kill or like catch. But ultimately, his old design was a lot more boring. I think his new design is a ton more fun to play. It's not quite an S tier rework because, as I said, there are a couple of problems with Odin's current design, and ultimately this rework didn't change all too much about him. It did change his playstyle substantially. It invented the bird bomb, so overall I think it was a really positive rework, and that's why it's in the A tier. Next up we have Raven, which might be our only other S tier rework in my opinion. I think what they've done with Raven since his original release is honestly incredible. So when Raven originally released, his ultimate was like a lock-on. It wasn't a targeted ability like it is now. You locked onto an enemy, it did very little damage, and then essentially you took full damage from the enemy you locked onto, but massively reduced damage from everyone else. So the idea was you create like a cage match, but ultimately it was very useless in the 1v1, and even in team fights, the enemy you're diving on is often the one that's going to be hitting you the most, and you just kind of got shredded, and it was a little bit useless. His 2 had no CC immunity on it, only damage immunity, so that was pretty frustrating. You could just get CC'd out of it very easily. His passive was different as well. Like, his 1 did an insanely low amount of damage and also had less range, and the way you made it do any substantial amount of damage was by stacking up your passive through those basic attacks. So the idea was, you know, you basic attack them like 5-6 times, and then your 1 is going to chunk them afterwards, but ultimately the 1 only did about the same damage as it does now at max passive stacks, so it was really weak. Raven was literally the weakest god release in the entire game, by the way, if you didn't know that. Raven's release was absolutely abysmal. I still had a lot of fun playing with him, and I think his old design with some tweaks could have been really good, but honestly, what they did with him, they've made him one of the most fun gods in the game, in my opinion. He flows so much better now. He works definitely a lot better as an assassin. And yeah, Raven's glow up, Raven's turnaround from his original release is absolutely incredible, which is why I think this rework deserves an S tier placement. Next up, we have Ratosa, which I think I will throw to the B tier? Maybe A. Maybe A. I think I'll throw him to the A tier if I'm being generous, which I'm trying to be on this tier list. So old Ratosa was quite a little bit different from new Ratosa. So his dash, it would go through enemies and it would reset the cooldown if you hit an enemy that you hadn't hit recently. And so effectively you could dash up to 6 times with old Ratosa. His 2 would spray out acorns from him and then they would come back to you after a limited time. So you could like spread out the acorns, do some damage, dash through someone, they all come back through to you and hit the enemy with like a lot of the acorns. His 3 was much the same, but it didn't have the stun component, and his ultimate was much the same, but it didn't have the knock-up opponent. So yeah, it was mainly the 1 and 2 that were different, but also the Acorns. He had a completely unique set of Acorns that we haven't seen since on his original release that were a ton of fun to play with, in my opinion. I'll put them all up on screen, but the main one that we have to talk about is Opal Acorn, which added lightning bolts to the side of his dash that procced on hit effects and could crit. And this was the main reason he was reworked, honestly, is what it feels like, because Opal Acorn was just so utterly broken. You could buy Golden Bow, and then the lightning procs did AoE damage on top of their initial damage with Golden Bow. You could make them slow with Frostbound Hammer, you could crit, you could proc kin size, you could proc all this stupid stuff. And because he could dash like 6 times in the fight, you could just dash through the whole fight, critting everyone, slowing them, proccing Golden Blade AoE damage, and just literally the entire team evaporated. It was really hard to balance, which is why I think this design is an A tier in my opinion, because modern Ratosa is still a ton of fun. I still love his design, but it's significantly more balanceable. Rat isn't really like a particularly problem character in terms of balance in modern day, whereas their original kit really was. And while I do think his original kit was more fun, I think there was a lot of potential with a lot of his old Acorns. I think since they added his new Acorns, because when they originally released him, he only had 1 Acorn and it was a little bit boring, but I'm counting the fact in this placement that he got his 4 new Acorns, which are still pretty interesting. And so yeah, he lost a little bit of fun factor for a lot more balanceability. It's very similar to Loki's rework. Like, original Rat was very frustrating to play against, even if he was one of the most fun characters in the game to play. And now I still think he is one of the most fun characters, but a little bit less fun to play, but is significantly easier to play against and to balance. And so I think this does deserve an A tier placement. Next up, we have Vulcan, which I think I will throw to the B tier. So Vulcan's original design, he was a Guardian, he was a lot more focused around his turrets. So his 2 was the same turret it's always been, his 1 was Backfire, same as it's always been, but his 3 was a Thumper turret that did pulsing AoE damage around it in a pretty large area. It wasn't the meatball that he has now. And his old ultimate would buff his protections, his movement speed, and then also the attack speed and protections and damage of all of his turrets. So basically you would try and throw down your 2, throw down your 3 in a team fight, pop your ultimate, and it was sort of like a Torbjorn style in a little bit of a way from Overwatch, where essentially your turrets would just do massively increased damage and have massively increased attack speed when you pop your ultimate. And ultimately, I think this design did fail pretty substantially, but I think there was some interesting components of it that maybe could be looked at for any future designs if they want to try and make like a turret or pet based design. And so that's the reason it's in the B tier, because I think Vulcan's design now is pretty good, but there are some problems. I think his old design was pretty good, but there were some problems as well. It's kind of similar to Arachne and Hell in that, like, I think this rework was a bit of a wash. Maybe you could argue it's A tier because modern Vulcan is a pretty fun design, but I do think there was a lot of interesting stuff in his old design that potentially could have been looked at to bring over. And hell, maybe in Smite 2 we can get some +1s related to his old design, where maybe like his ultimate leaves behind the Thumper turret, or his ultimate increases the attack speed and damage of his 2 when you cast it, or something like that. Could be interesting, and yeah, that's why I think this is B tier. It was very much of a wash. There was some cool things and some bad things in his old design, and there's some cool things and bad things in his new design, in my opinion. Moving on though, we have Steroid Basset. So this was the one where Basset's ultimate became a steroid where you create 2 cats at the side of you, and they essentially replicated your abilities for a reduced effect. So when you jumped, you would have 2 other AoEs on the side, and when you threw your 3, it was on the 3 cats, 2 on the side, and then your main cat, and they would do reduced damage. Same thing with the 2. And I think this design was actually super fun to play with. I actually really loved this design, like playing as, but it was incredibly broken. It was absolutely stupid. It would just completely one-shot people. It was pretty much unbalanceable, and that's why they reworked her again. And much like all of these other ones in B tier, that's the reason it's here. There was some really cool aspects to the steroid design, but ultimately it was kind of unworkable. And then moving on to CC Bastet, which is basically her current design. I call this CC because she never had any hard CC before, but now she does on her ultimate. You can pull people in. And yeah, I think this design is B tier also because it really hasn't fixed any of the problems that make Bastet frustrating to play against and hard to balance. I don't think either of these in any particular way are better than her original design where she summoned the 3 cats. I think they're about the same. They're all really frustrating to play against and really hard to balance. Bastet maybe just needs some kind of larger rework rather than just changing her ultimate, in my opinion. But the reason they're not lower on the tier list is because they're just fine. All 3 of the ultimates that Bastet has had have had their problems and had their upsides, in my opinion. And finally, let's move on to Freya. So I believe, honestly, probably both of these Freya reworks are going to go in the F tier because they literally failed and they ended up reverting her to her original design anyway. But first up, we have Burst Freya, which was where her 2 was a toggle. We'll talk about the toggle a little bit more in the next design. But her 2 was a toggle where you would go ranged or melee whenever you wanted. The ranged autos cost mana and the melee autos refunded mana and did bonus damage. The ranged autos would also go through all minions and stop at the first god hit. That was pretty crucial. And then her 1 basically turned into your next basic attack does massively increase bonus damage in an AoE. It was 1 hit, and that's why it's called Burst Freya, because in this era, you would play Freya in mid, you would build Book of Thoth and full magical power, you would press 2 and press 1, and then literally just evaporate 80% of someone's health bar. It was a ton of fun, but it was probably the most unbalanced version of Freya we've ever seen. You just built Polynomicon, Book of Thoth, brought it to Hootie, full power, and you would literally just one-shot people in a massive AoE. It was completely unfun to play against, completely unbalanceable. It was fun fun to play, but ultimately there's a certain level that you have to go to where like you can't just make gods that are fun to play. You have to make gods that are also fair and fun to play against, and this was not that. And Toggle Freya probably also goes in the F tier. So this one, this happened after Burst Freya, and they made her 1 into a 5-hit ability instead of a 1-hit ability. This was a little bit more balanced and a little bit less fun, but ultimately it had a lot of the same problems that Burst Freya had, and it still had a lot of the same problems that current Freya has in her like Mark II design. And yeah, ultimately I think both of these have to go to the F tier because they're clearly failed reworks if they literally got reverted back to her original design. And yes, her original design is still trash, but that doesn't mean these get placed any higher up the tier list. They were still completely failed reworks in my opinion. But yeah, there you go. That is what I think of all of Smite's reworks over the years. Maybe Hi-Rez can take a look at this and think, you know, what was successful about these reworks that are up here and what was unsuccessful about these reworks that were down here, and maybe we can get a few in Smite 2. I don't have a lot of hope for it based on how they've talked about reworks on the Titan Talks. I highly doubt they're gonna like fully rework any characters, to be honest. They'll probably just give characters +1s and maybe some minor changes to really problematic ones like Arachne and stuff. But yeah, we shall see. What do you guys think? Do you have any of these reworks that maybe I put in the F tier that you think were really good? Are you a big fan of Nox and Newa? Or are you like really not a fan of new Loki? Did you like old Loki a lot more? Let me know down below and I'll catch you guys for another one later on. Have a great day and peace out, you nerds.